Thank you, Senator Conroy. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak in opposition of this bill, and we've heard several comments from my Greens colleagues about this piece of legislation and just how risky, unnecessary and dangerous this legislation actually is for everyday Australians, not to mention Australian journalists. We oppose this bill as it is unnecessary, disproportionate and ineffective in its means of achieving its stated objective of protecting Australia's national security. Now, I know that national security is the hot topic in this place, always is when a Prime Minister's polls are on the fall, and it staggers me that the Labor Party has gotten to a point where they now are prepared to stand here and try and sell their position, which of course we all know is more about wanting to show that there is not a glimmer of difference between the opposition and the government on national security issues, rather than allowing proper scrutiny of a piece of legislation that is fundamentally going to change the way we assess and manage people's personal data. This bill also risks undermining fundamental aspects of our free society. The ability for journalists to keep their sources free of intimidation, of blackmail, of being hunted down because the government of the day doesn't like that they've blown the whistle, and obviously provides for easy access for hackers to treasure troves of the most private details of people's everyday lives. This is actually putting Australians more at risk than actually protecting them. These risks are very real and they are, of course, very serious. This bill will turn all Australians into suspects by forcing telecommunications companies to store data pertaining to all Australians, telephone calls, emails and other data over a 2-year period. The legislation will not store, of course, the content of phone calls and emails. For example, calls won't be recorded, the contents of emails won't be recorded, the contents of SMS messages. However, the legislation will require telecommunications companies to store the so-called metadata. For example, the legislation will require the storage of details for who you called and when and from where, that physical location, which mobile phone you used at that particular place, and who, of course, you made that phone call to. It will store the details of who you emailed and when. Make no mistake that this bill, if it becomes law, risks fundamentally changing what we understand today to be a free society. Australians' private lives will become, to a large degree, public. This bill makes a disingenuous distinction between metadata and the substance or contents of communications. As experts have made abundantly clear throughout the committee process of this bill, which my colleague Senator Ludlam has participated wholeheartedly in and is probably the best expert in this place on this issue, that this, of course, is a false dichotomy. While metadata has been used as a useful term in the days when telephony may have made up the lion's share of our electronic communication, in an age where most Australians live their lives on smartphones or on tablets and PCs, that argument is simply just not the case. The details that can be disclosed from the so-called metadata on a person's electronic device, particularly over a continuous 2-year period, is extraordinary. It is intrusive, it may be embarrassing to some people, and of course it may risk, if indeed that information was to fall into the wrong hands, very, very damaging to that person's own understanding of their self, where they fit in their community, who their friends are, who they work for, and of course what is their place in Australia's online and real-life community. Evidence of current metadata requests under the current regime shows that a massive number have nothing to do with solving serious crimes, but instead relate to petty requests by agencies such as the Australian Tax Office, the Department of Human Services, to track what ordinary Australians not suspected of any serious crime are doing. So why the red flag on national security? Because we wouldn't. That, of course, pushes buttons. But knowing where a Centrelink recipient is at a particular time when they made that phone call, who they made it to, and that is the type of information that we are talking here, and the type of exposure of individuals' private lives that is at risk. Under the new legislation, the Attorney-General will be able to add agencies to these lists to access metadata. Further, history shows that data will be hacked and leaked to the internet, and there's no way the government can pretend that they can guarantee that wouldn't happen, leading to massive privacy breaches. We know, of course, that the Immigration Department has been involved in one of their own scandals of breaching privacy and data when they accidentally released the names, the numbers, the addresses, the ages, the nationalities of over 10,000 asylum seekers here in Australia. And who overwhelmingly accessed that data? Governments and sources with international IP addresses, putting those 10,000 people who are seeking asylum and protection from their home countries at even more risk, because it has now been exposed that indeed they were in Australia seeking protection. And that's just one example of a system that is a current system that has gone wrong, not to mention when every single Australian will be subjected to this idea of having their metadata stored for 2 years. Just imagine the risk that puts if that type of information fell into the wrong hands. There is a real risk, and there's been some talk about this recently, there is a real risk that this legislation will lead to the undermining of the anonymity of journalist sources. In this context, I'm particularly concerned of the effect that this legislation will have on the vital work being done by whistleblowers in Australia's detention centres, including our offshore detention centres. As recently as last week, the Moss Review has demonstrated that the Australian government cannot be trusted to protect asylum seekers and refugees from abuses, and cannot be trusted to tell the truth about what is going on. This government has already proven they are more interested in shooting the whistleblower and covering up the crime than in fact dealing with the issue at hand. This government cannot be trusted with this level of sensitive information and data. The government can't be trusted to be transparent and accountable with what goes on in their government departments. They cannot be trusted, at least from what we've seen from the Moss Review, to know and to be in control of what's going on in their own detention centres. Employees working in our abusive and shambolic detention centres, both here and offshore, are already subject to very tight contracts, confidentiality gag clauses that restrict them from being able to speak out and tell the truth. The government system forces those people, even when they see wrongdoing, to be quiet about it, to shush, to don't speak up. And the only way through this cloud of secrecy is to blow the whistle. And what happens when you blow the whistle, Mr. Acting Deputy President? The government puts the AFP onto you. You start being investigated. You start being investigated for blowing the whistle on abuse claims in detention centres. That's what we've seen happen, only as recently as the last few weeks. This government has proven themselves already to be obsessed with secrecy, obsessed with cover-up, and cannot be trusted to tell the truth. And even then, when they have the information, they can't be trusted to keep it kept securely. If our Australian expats working in offshore detention centres cannot be safe from the abuse of surveillance, protections of whistleblowing, protected when they stand up and report crimes, how on earth can we trust that this government is going to treat the Australian public here on the mainland properly with this type of invasive collection of personal data? These risks are simply unacceptable. They are disproportionate to achieving the bill's objectives. And this is because that while ordinary Australians will be subjected to the draconian intrusion of their private lives created by this bill, those who set out to do Australia harm, we really want to talk about national security, will be so easily undetected and will be able to avoid this type of surveillance. It staggers me that this is actually an unsafe and risky joke of the government, this piece of legislation. They set out to say that it is about protecting the Australian people. We've got no trust that they're able to do that, and in fact the very people that they are saying that the Australian government tells us we need to be protected from are going to be able to work their way around this legislation in seconds. It is a false dream that is being sold by this government. There is no protection of ordinary Australians of the awful things that perhaps somebody might want to unleash on our communities. This does not keep us protected, but what it does do is weakens not just freedom in our society, but it weakens the protections for people who have legitimate reasons for leaking information, for blowing the whistle and for calling out bad government decisions. We know that the Australian government, the Immigration Department in particular, has already got a number of witch hunts underway in relation to whistleblowers who work in Australian detention centres. Why on earth they're spending energy on that rather than on the people that the government suggests we need to be protected from is beyond me. This bill does not make Australians safer. This bill puts Australians' lives at further risk, and it weakens our ability to have an independent, robust and free society that is underpinned by the ability of journalists in particular to keep their sources private and protected and free of intimidation.